throughout the festival, please use the hashtag LFL2019 and do not crowd the speakers as they come off the stage. Thank you. Chennai Kalai Tiruvizha. The Hindu Lit for Life is committed towards making this festival a zero-waste event by reducing our environmental footprint and enlarging our social footprint. So we encourage all of you to bring your own bottle, bags, and travel by public transport or bicycle. Water is free as it should be at the Hindu Lit for Life, and the LFL takes its first step towards being the first zero-waste lit fest. We would appreciate it if the audience carried their own bottles and refill them as at the various dispensers across the venue. We encourage you to use public transport to come to the Lit Fest. If you do, please keep your ticket and head towards the Zero Waste counter for a reward. Thank you. Welcome back to the 9th edition of the Hindu Lit for Life Festival. We now start with a book launch by Lara Fergus, a Tamil translation of that. We invite Ms. Samarachi Thangapandian to come over to release it, and Susan will be receiving the copy of that. Susan is receiving the first copy of the Tamil translation of Lara Fergus' book. Thank you very much, ma'am. We will now have a reading of this by Ms. Samarachi Thangapandian. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here along with this eminent writer and my dear lovely Nandini Krishnan. Hello. And again, it's a privilege to release the Tamil translation of Lara Fergus, My Sister Chaos. I haven't read the original English book, but I happened to read the Tamil translation of this book, and it has really touched my heart. It's a journey of a woman. Nobody is given any specific name, neither we know about which country she comes from. It's just a journey of a woman who chooses to be a lesbian and how she faces a life in a war-tormented region, her search for the loved one and all those things. The main thing I find very interesting in the book is the hyphenated situation. You know, if you're dead, there's a certainty to death. But this woman is more tormented by the fact of the missing people. There's no idea about where your missed ones are gone in a war-affected area, and you lose the certainty which death gives. It's a continuous torment and torture to lose your dear and near ones, always in search of them. The whole book deals with that area, and some of the chapters are really, really painful, and I can't just skip through without tears in my eyes. So let me just read a few passages, just for 5 minutes, from the Tamil translation. Hope you can relate to it in a better way when Nandini picks up a conversation afterwards. இழப்பின் வரைபடம். எல்லாவற்றையும் போரில் இழந்தது உண்மையே. நாம் சொந்தமாக்கிக் கொள்ளும் விஷயங்களிலேயே மிக மோசமானது நிலம்தான். அதிலும் நம்மை ஓரிடத்தில் கட்டிப்போட்டு நாம் இருக்கும் இடத்தை மற்றவர்கள் அறிந்து கொள்ளும்படி செய்துவிடுகிறது நிலம். அது ஆபத்தானது. அதனால்தான் எனக்கு கிராமப்பகுதிகளோ சிறிய ஊர்களோ பிடிப்பதில்லை. என்னை மற்றவர்கள் கூர்ந்து பார்ப்பதை என்னால் சகித்து கொள்ள முடிவதில்லை. இந்த புதிய நாட்டில் எங்கு வசிப்பது என்று முடிவு செய்ய வேண்டியிருந்த போது நான் இந்த நகரத்தை, இந்த நாட்டில் இரண்டாவது மிகப்பெரிய நகரமான இதனை தேர்வு செய்தேன். சிலருக்கு கும்பல் அதிகம் நிறைந்திருக்கின்ற ஊரில் வாழ வேண்டியிருக்கின்றது. அது அவர்களுக்கு தேவையாகவும் இருக்கின்றது. ஒரு சமூகத்துடன் இணைந்து இருப்பது அவசியம் என்று நினைக்கிறார்கள். ஆனால் அவர்கள் தீவிரமாக சிந்தித்திருக்கவில்லை என்று நான் நினைக்கின்றேன். நாம் உயிரோடு இருக்கிறோமா இல்லை இறந்து விட்டோமா என்பது பற்றி அக்கறை கொள்ளும் நபர்கள் உண்மையில் நமக்கு தேவையில்லை. கனவு போன்ற இடைப்பட்ட காலம் ஒன்று இருந்தது. யுத்தம் அறிவிக்கப்பட்ட பின் 1 வாரத்திற்கு மேல் நிலவிய காலம். அப்பொழுது எங்கள் நாட்டின் வடபகுதியில் போர் வலுவடைந்து கொண்டிருந்தது. அந்த குறுகிய காலத்தில் என்ன நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கிறது, அதை எதிர்கொள்ள எங்களை எப்படி தயார்படுத்தி கொள்ள வேண்டும் என்பதை எங்களால் புரிந்து கொள்ள முடியவில்லை. எனவே மக்கள் எப்பொழுதும் போல செயல்பட்டு கொண்டிருந்தனர். நான் வேலைக்கு சென்றேன். என்னுடைய பிரிவில் ஏறத்தாழ அனைவருமே உலகளாவிய வரைபட பணியில் ஈடுபட்டிருந்தோம். பூமியின் நிலப்பரப்பு முழுவதற்குமான தரவுகளை ஒரே சீரான தரப்படுத்தப்பட்ட வடிவில் வழங்குவதற்கான முயற்சி. பணி முடிய 2 மாதங்கள் இருக்கும் பொழுது போர் மூண்டது. எல்லைகள் குலையத் தொடங்கின. அதெல்லாம் ஒரு பிரச்சனையாக இருக்காது என்று எனக்கு நானே சொல்லிக்கொண்டேன். எல்லைக்கோடுகள் நகர்வது என்பது வெறும் அரசியலே. நடைமுறைக்கும் திட்டமிடுதலுக்கும் அது ஒரு அசௌகரியமாக இருக்கலாம். ஆனால் சமாளிக்க முடியாததல்ல. மொத்த நிலப்பரப்பு என்னவோ மாறப்போவதில்லை. எங்கள் அலுவலகம் இருந்த கட்டிடத்தை மூடப்போவதாகவும் நாங்கள் எல்லோரும் வெளியேற வேண்டும் என்றும் அவர்கள் ஒரு நாள் சொன்னபொழுது நான் திடுக்கிட்டேன். ஒரே ஒரு USB கருவியில் தேவையான தரவுகளை எடுத்துக்கொண்டேன். அதை என் கழுத்தில் ஒரு கயிற்றில் அணிந்து கொண்டு ஆடைக்குள் மறைத்து கொண்டேன். போருக்கு முன் இருந்த என்னுடைய நாடு எடையற்றதாய் என் கழுத்தில் இன்றும் தொங்கிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. எடையற்றதாய் என் கழுத்தில் இன்னும் தொங்கிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. அதிகார பலம் அதிகம் இல்லாதவர்களே சிறந்த வரைபடவியலாளர்கள் ஆகிறார்கள். நாங்கள் எங்கு இருக்கிறோம், மற்றவர்களுக்கும் எங்களுக்குமான இடைவெளி என்ன என்பதை அறிந்து கொள்வது எங்களுக்கு அவசியம். தங்கள் வீடுகளிலேயே இருக்க அதிகாரம் பெற்றவர்களுக்கும் உலகமே தங்களுடைய வீடு என்று இருப்பவர்களுக்கும் இது தேவைப்படுவதில்லை. அதிகாரம் வாய்ந்த செய்தி நிறுவனம் ஒன்று என்னுடைய நாட்டின் வரைபடத்தை காட்டிக் கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. எந்தெந்த நகரங்களில் கலவரங்கள், குண்டுவெடிப்புகள் நிகழ்ந்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றன என்பதை காட்ட சிறிய தீப்பிழம்புகளை குறியீடுகளாக பயன்படுத்துகிறார்கள். ஊர்கள் தப்பும் தவறுமாக குறிக்கப்பட்டுள்ளன. நான் பிறந்த ஊர் வேறொரு பெயரால் குறிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கின்றது. அது ஏன் என்னை இவ்வளவு பாதிக்கிறது என்று எனக்கு புரியவில்லை. என்னுடைய அம்மாவை நான் கடைசியாக பார்த்தது அந்த ஊரில் தான் என்பதால் இருக்கலாம். அம்மாவுடன் மதிய உணவு நினைத்து பார்க்கின்றேன். உரையாடல் அதன் வழக்கமான தடத்தில்தான் எப்பொழுதும் போகும். அந்த உரையாடலின் கருப்பொருள் அவமானம். தன்னுடைய மகள் திருமணம் செய்து கொள்ளாமல் இருப்பதை குறித்து என் அம்மாவுக்கு ஏற்படும் அவமானம். மகள் படித்திருந்தும் ஒருவேளை அதுவே தடையாகவும் இருக்கலாம். கணவனை தேடிக்கொள்ளவில்லை. அவளுக்கு குழந்தைகள் இல்லை. எனவே அவள் மகிழ்ச்சியாக இல்லை. தன் மகளை பற்றி நல்ல செய்திகளை அக்கம் பக்கத்தாரிடம் சொல்ல முடியவில்லை என்பதால் வரும் அவமானம். தன் வாழ்க்கையை மகள் ஆமோதிக்கவில்லை என்ற அவமானம். தற்பெருமை என்பது இனி இருவருக்குமே பிடிபடப் போவதில்லை என்பதில் உள்ள அவமானம். 10 வயதில் அந்த ஊரை விட்டு வெளியேறிய என் சகோதரி அங்கு திரும்பிச் செல்லவில்லை. அவளால் முடியவில்லை. நான் தனியாக வாழ்வது எவ்வளவு கடினமோ அதனை விட கடினம் அவள் மற்ற பெண்களுடன் சேர்ந்து வாழ்வது. நாங்கள் இப்பொழுது இருக்கும் இந்த அந்நிய நாட்டை காட்டிலும் அந்த ஊரில் நாங்கள் அந்நியமாக உணர்ந்தோம். நாங்கள் இப்பொழுது இருக்கும் இந்த அந்நிய நாட்டை காட்டிலும் அந்த ஊரில் நாங்கள் அந்நியர்களாக உணர்ந்தோம். போர் எங்களை நாடு கடத்துவதற்கு வெகு காலத்திற்கு முன்னரே நாங்கள் நாடு கடத்தப்பட்டவர்களாக உணர்ந்தோம். நன்றி. தேங்க்யூ.
lot of time, right? Yeah. So I was when I first read the book, My Sister Chaos. I read it in English, and I was stunned by the book, and I sent Susan and Lara an email saying, I can't believe this book was written and this book was published, and it left me shaken, and I couldn't read anything else for several days. And when Prasanna said the Tamil translation was going to be released, I did wonder who could possibly do justice to it. And when I saw the translator's name, I knew it had to be him. You know, Anirudhan Vasudevan he's a dear friend of mine as well. And as Kannan Sundaram said, he's a dear friend of everyone's. He's just that lovable. So, and he's as talented as he's lovable, as all of you will see once you read the translation. Unfortunately, Lara couldn't be with us in person here today. But one of Susan's characters in her novel Dark Matters says, I'm an optimist. You have to be if you're a feminist in these times. So we are optimists and we are subversive. So Lara and I did something overnight. I asked her if she would consider sending video answers to questions that I intended to ask her and Susan. And she did. So she spent the night sending me answers. I spent the night editing them. And so in accordance with the theme of Women in Exile, we'll have Lara in exile speaking to us on video. So perhaps Hari has very kindly offered to play the video clip. So perhaps we should start right away with, would you like, should we start with Lara introducing herself, the book, and reading out a short section from the book in English? Hari, if you could play clip number 1, please.
Hello, everyone. This is a little odd to be speaking at you from the other side of the world and participating on a panel like this, talking into a camera. But I really do appreciate Nandini for going out of her way to make it possible for me to sort of come in by video. So thanks again, Nandini, and thanks to the Hindu Life Festival for making it possible. Before I start, I just want to say thanks to Susan, who's sitting there and who I haven't seen for years in person. I would have loved to be there with you and with everyone else. Susan published my book through Spinifex Press and also made it possible in many ways, was a mentor throughout the process. So nice to be on a panel with you, Susan, and thank you. Okay, so before I start, Nandini's asked me to do a short reading. I'll just give you a brief overview of the book to put it in some sort of context. My Sister Chaos, and sorry, I'm sort of half reading off a piece of paper here as well, so excuse me for doing that. My Sister Chaos is about 2 sisters who have had to leave their home country because of war and who end up as refugees in an unnamed second country. It's set largely in the house and workplace of one of the sisters, who is a cartographer, and she is embarking on this sort of intense, mad strategy to map the world around her in extensive detail, and starting with her house. Meanwhile, her sister, who is a painter, arrives unexpectedly, and she's on a different mission. Her mission is to find the lover and the son that she got separated from in the war that made them refugees. And the 2 separate quests of the sisters, if you like, start to become entangled and entwined as the book goes on. So the scene I'm going to read is from a later part of the novel where they have become entwined. The cartographer's sister has taken her map hostage, and in order to get it back, the cartographer needs to help her sister find the place where her lover and son were last held. To do that, the cartographer needs to access mapping data from her old country that she has actually kept secretly on a USB stick and has been hiding from everyone, colleagues in her last country and colleagues in her new country, who would all be interested in this data because it's from a big international project called the Global Map Project, which really exists. So the cartographer, in order to get this data for her sister, needs to access a particular software, and this software is only available in her new workplace. But she doesn't have open access to it. She needs to get the help of a colleague. And she goes to see such a sympathetic colleague, a mathematician who she's relatively friendly with. So the scene starts in that is the mathematician's office. And the first person is the cartographer. I reach under my collar and hook my finger around the strip of fabric that holds the memory stick. I draw it out of my shirt, pull it over my head, and hold it forward to her, its metallic surface shining in my right palm. The strip of fabric curls and falls between my fingers. The mathematician looks from my eyes to my palm and back again. "What's on it?" she asks. I don't know where to start. She hesitates, then leans forward and takes it between her thumb and forefinger. Her fingertips barely graze the skin of my palm. The strip of fabric ripples through my fingers and is gone. It's all gone. She has it in her hand. I feel raw, as if I have lost the upper layer of my skin, and am sensitive to her every displacement of air. With her thumb, she pushes back the hinged cover of the memory stick and slides the exposed metallic tip of the USB stick into the port of her computer. She looks over at me. "What is it?" she asks again. I close my own hand and put it in my pocket, draw out the folded strip of newspaper and smooth it on my lap. The coordinates are listed in pencil in my sister's clumsy hand. There are points where the pencil has gone through the paper as my sister wrote, without a surface to lean against next to the wall. I look up. The mathematician is looking at the screen. "Can I open these files?" she asks. I want to say no. I want to grab back the memory stick and leave. I fear, unreasonably, that in clicking the mouse she will open me up, that I will be exposed. But I'm not guilty of anything. I have the right to have a map of my country, to carry it with me. I have the right to keep it to myself. This is my data more than anyone's. I made it. She turns back to me. "Is that what you want?" she asks. I swivel the chair one way and the other in a tight rhythm. What choice do I have anyway, if I want my map back? I nod. I hear her double-click, pause, double-click again. She frowns at the screen. "What language is this?" she asks. "Mine," I say. She glances up, then looks back at the files. I watch her clicking and sliding and clicking the mouse as she moves through the files. I'm going to have to explain. She's not going to know what to look for. Then she says, "Where did these come from? They look like global map files." I remember then that there is the same way of organising the files in the different countries. One raster and 4 vector application formats in the first folder, and then once you open them up, the same layout for each. The final folder is labelled with a single letter. The whole project is, after all, about international consistency. She stops clicking and looks up at me. "How did you get this data?" she asks. "It's mine," I say. "What country is it for?" "Mine." She leans back again, folds her arm and tilts her head at me. "I thought it was all lost," she says. I laugh, as if it was something funny but not very important. "So did I lie." She doesn't move. She smiles slightly, but only because I'm smiling. When I stop, so does she. I decide to tell her. Most of it, not all of it. I omit things, like my sister. And I add others, like the bit where I thought I'd lost the USB stick, where it had slipped into the lining of my suitcase and only fell out because I was trying to put the case on top of my wardrobe, because I had to tilt it to get it up there, and luckily I'd forgotten to zip the case closed, because otherwise the stick wouldn't have slid out. It would have stayed in there, and I might not have found it for another 2 years. It's details like this that make a story sound convincing, I'm told. But she just stares at me across the desk. "Why did you bring it to me?" she asks. "Because I can't access the software. I can't open the files." "What's that?" she asks, nodding at the strip of newspaper in my lap. "The reason I need to." Okay, I'll leave it there and let Nandini pass on to the next part. Hello, everyone.
So we were able to get Lara here after all, despite the best efforts of the visa offices. By the way, Susan's book, the one which she's going to read from now, would endear her greatly to the current government. And maybe you should tell them the story of how you started working on your project, Cow.
Well, in 2009, I lived here for 4 months in Chennai. I had applied for a grant called the Asia Link grant, which enabled me to come to the University of Madras and be located here in Chennai. It took me 3 goes to get the grant. The first time I wrote about, in my application, I wrote about sexuality. In the second grant, I wrote about women. In my third grant, I only wrote about cows. But actually, what I was really applying for was exactly the same grant. I didn't change really anything else. I just changed the word to cows. And there's a reason for this, because there are actually lesbian codes around cows. Gertrude Stein said of her lover, Alice B. Toklas, Alice had a cow. What she meant was that Alice had an orgasm. And then there is Suniti Namjoshi's wonderful book called Conversations with Cow, which is conversations between a woman in Canada and a Brahman cow that she has found in a paddock, who's just an ordinary, everyday lesbian separatist cow. And they become great friends. So there are lots of reasons, you know, for using the word cow. I also grew up on a farm. I have known cows of all kinds. And so, yeah, I had this chance to come and be here. My cow in my book, Cow, and as you see, I didn't even bother about putting the word there because the pictures tell the story itself. My cow is called Queenie. The word queen actually comes from the Sanskrit word for cow, gal. And it goes back then through the Norwegians and the English and so forth. And I've got an etymology in the front so you can follow that. I'm trying to think. I'm going to read 2 parts of the first poem. The first part is a childhood memory. It's called What the Poet Says, and it begins with a quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein, his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which I studied when I was at university, and it says, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." Sounds a bit to me like what happens to lesbians. I picture a cow. She is grand and I am small. I walk behind her saying, "Come on," as low as I can. I shoo her along the milking yard with her calf. I walk beside her rump, and when we reach the wooden gate, she follows me. She knows the routine. I turn to leave, pass by her head, her rump. She strikes out with her horns. I will not go near her again. I fear this cow inside me. I have doubled in age and I am learning the internal properties of cow. "Stand your ground," yells my father, as the biggest cow of the herd breaks away and runs straight at me. I wave my arms about, wave the stick at the end of my arms. She is still running. I jump and scream and wave 2 metres before I am history. She veers sideways and returns to the herd. I have found my cow inside. I have learnt the internal property that she will give way if you stand your ground. Stand your ground, I say to myself. Even the internal cow is impressed. So in the next section, I'm skipping a bit because it's a bit long to keep reading. Nandini wanted me to read a section, so I'm beginning halfway through one section and into another. The moment when I hear unspoken histories, genocides, eliminations of the unwanted, every rewriting of history continues that erasure. If I assert that XX does not exist, but XX continues, albeit silently and invisibly, who will assert XX's existence? Those who refuse XX refuse my existence. Replace XX with XXY. It is the pseudo-concept that kills particularity, amoeba-like, surrounds the grain of truth, absorbs, de-differentiates. The name XX is the proper sign, subject, particular. The cow is in the cowshed, sensual cow who sidles up to another, licks her thigh. She is cow both gentle and strong, eats grass but can kill with horns and hooves. She is galactic cow, milk cow, origin of all, mother and lover, sister and aunt, friend and cousin. She is the golden calf worshipped from east and west. Al-Lat, Latona, Leda, latte bringer, golden calf and graven image, worshipped in the east, worshipped in the west. So this cow actually is also the cow that created the universe, and the way you can tell that is because the word galaxy is the same word, gives the Greek word gala for milk. So you know there's been a cow there somewhere. And I've received a fabulous thing from a friend in Australia yesterday saying there's a new... what is a black hole or neutron star or something out there that has had this huge explosion. And you know what they call it? The cow. I thought, yes, I can feel another poem coming on, but I haven't written it yet.
Someone had a great cow.
Exactly.
So the reason I asked Susan if she could read this out was that when you buy My Sister Chaos and read it, and when you buy Cow and read it, both of which I would do immediately if I were you, I mean, hear out the session and then buy it, but you'll see how beautifully the two inform each other, though they were written at completely different times and by completely different people and just published by the same person. But so what interested me was what inspired, usually fiction is inspired by certain events or things or experiences that one has had or seen or observed. So I asked Lara if she could speak about some of what made her write My Sister Chaos, and Hari, if you could play clip number 2.
I'm brief because I find it really difficult to answer. I think that, like, probably what drives the authors of a lot of like first novels, when it's for the first time you've written anything, it's all the obsessions that you've been carrying with you all your life. For me, that was obsessions around how we represent our world and how we make meaning of our world, and particularly the paradoxes that are inherent to that process, whether through something as logical and orderly as cartography or whether through artistic processes. There are also these ideas or patterns, if you like, to do with exile, which is the title of the panel today, and particularly lesbian exile. So I was really interested in the parallels between exile from country and the refugee experience, which I'd had a fair bit of sort of professional experience in my work as a human rights activist, and then a sort of interior exile from your own family or community that is the experience of a lot of lesbians and gay men and others. And I wanted to sort of break open the sort of the similarities between these different forms of exiles, and then the layering, or what we'd call intersectionality, of when those things come together, because both of the sisters are sort of exiled and talk about being exiles before the war made it formal, and have experienced that firsthand. So I think I'll leave it there.
So yesterday, when you and I were talking, Susan, about a story arc in Dark Matters, where you speak about a lineage of relatives who are lesbians, and you spoke about the theme of exile. So perhaps you'd like to tell the audience a little bit about the aunt-niece relationship that you speak about and the idea of exile. And sort of, when we spoke about the idea of the maiden aunt, who was, there were maiden aunts throughout literature, and it never occurred to me until a few years ago that perhaps they were lesbian women. And one was expected to feel sorry for them because they didn't have a man, but they probably had a lot of cows.
Probably. Sign of wealth. Well, in terms of exile, there are actually two aunt-niece relationships in my book. The main character, her name is Kate. Sometimes she calls herself Hekaterina because her mother is Greek, and so she has this alter ego that she uses from time to time. One of her great aunts is living in exile in Britain, and she never ever returns to the family. And it occurs to Kate at some point that probably she was a lesbian because there were no marriages. The only photos she has of her is her standing with another woman, and she never returns home. And it's a trope that I have noticed amongst my lesbian friends, many of whom are living in exile in some sort of way. My partner is originally from Europe. She has not gone back home. I myself, I'm Australian, but I grew up in a small, near a small country town, and there's no way that I would be able to live in the small country town that I come from. I wouldn't be accepted. Well, maybe now, you know, the things are shifting a little, but I've been a lesbian since 1974. So, you know, there's a lot of years in between then and now that it wouldn't have been possible for me to get by. And in my novel as well, the other character, Mercedes, who is the lover of Kate, she comes from a family who have been refugees from Chile, and they had to escape Chile in the mid-1970s in order to get out of the country where the Pinochet regime had come in. So they were politically active. And that becomes a critical part in the novel because it gives her a certain understanding of what, and her family, of what needs to be done after the group of men come in and abduct Kate and take her off to prison and torture her. But the other interesting thing with Mercedes is this crime of abduction and imprisonment and rape and torture that Kate goes through is never talked about in the newspapers, never, ever, ever. And Mercedes' family is politically smart, and they declare her dead. So one of the Chilean expats comes and certifies her and is a doctor, and so certifies her dead. But that also means that she is exiled from all her previous friends, so she has nothing either. So there are multiple ways in which exile is explored, and I think for me it's a very important part of lesbian existence. And actually there's just one tiny little bit that I want to read that I thought about this morning. Must be a different page. I thought it was 38, must be 138. And if it's not, then I'll give up. No. Yes, no. It must be a different page.
You could probably do a search for it on the e-book.
No, I have written it down in my notebook.
Oh, yeah.
Page 60, that's what it is. 138 was a different one. This is a story about when Kate goes off to Greece. So, like most people, in her case, whose mother has emigrated. She decides to go back to the country where her mother is from. She has a very short-term affair with a woman in a small Greek village that goes for a few weeks, and they both get something out of it. You know, the woman in the village is, you know, have this short affair, and Kate has a way of finding her way into the Greek culture. But then she says she's a bit disappointed after a few weeks because she expected to know the woman. She expected her to know more about Crete and its history. And Kate says to her, "I told her that she should get out of this village, move to Heraklion or Chania, so she could meet others like her. But she was rooted in her village in a way I could not and would not understand. I thought, if I can leave remote rural Australia, why can't you leave isolated village life in Crete? It's a conundrum that exercises me still. How should a lesbian live? Should she prefer the diaspora and lose her roots? Or should she remain inside an oppressive culture and take what comes? Elena had decided to take what comes, and I was one of those who came and who left just like all the others."
So on the theme of exile and on the theme of rights and expectations living at home, Australia had a historic vote recently on gay marriage. And so I put the question to Lara and asked her of what significance it is to her. So perhaps you could play clip number 3 and then we'll get Susan to respond.
So, I could talk a lot about the vote on gay marriage. I think there's lots of ways to come at it. I work as a sort of activist and policymaker as well, so I have very strong opinions on it from a political perspective. And from a political perspective, I think it was a destructive and opportunistic sham, basically, in terms of a vote, in terms of the way the process was done. We had no need constitutionally or legally or in any aspect of our democratic systems to put that to a plebiscite. It was done for highly political reasons. And when you put the question of whether a minority should have its rights to a majority vote, I think it actually undermines your democracy and doesn't strengthen it. So that would be my take on it politically. From a perspective of whether it's creating social change and whether it's going to, reduce persecution, discrimination against lesbians and gay men in future, I think that we're yet to find out. Having a plebiscite itself, I think, from a social change perspective, can risk sort of calcifying the opinions of those who are voting, because if you're sort of nailing your colours to the mast, you're forced to articulate something that you might not yet have articulated, which can work both ways. If you decide to come down on you're for it, you're supporting lesbians and gay men to get married, then that's a positive thing. If you decide that you're against it, then it's no matter how society changes in future, no matter how your own views might change, it's a difficult thing to admit you're wrong always. And sort of analyses of voting behaviour show that people often go on to support an issue or the issues that a politician they've voted for support because they don't want to admit fault, even if they're starting to shift themselves. So there's that issue with the plebiscite. There's obviously, though, a huge number of positives to the result of the plebiscite, which is that equal marriage has now been brought into law, which is great for those of us that want to get married. So, and also for social norms, it's a simple equality of treatment before the law that is, I think, necessary for any democracy. So, on a personal note, though, I would just say that it did have a certain significance to me because it made me realise how much social norms have shifted in my own lifetime. To get to a point where 2/3 of the population voted yes for equal marriage, I mean, that would just not have happened, I think, even 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. It did have the downside of making you think, well, that means 1 changes to social norms and the ways in which LGBTI people are treated remains to be seen, I think. Obtaining legal equality is, as you know, and anyone who's a woman, a person of colour, has a disability will understand, is that really only the first step in any process towards a more substantive equality. So, yeah, I think we've still probably got a fair way to go on that.
What she said reminded me of the section which Tamirachi read out in the beginning, which was the section which deals with the sister going home to the mother and speaking of how the mother is embarrassed about having an unmarried daughter and how the other sister is worse because she lives in a community of women. And that's exactly what Lara talks about, right? 2/3 vote against. Susan, would you like to add to that?
Well, yes. I have probably a stronger view. It had absolutely no effect on me. I mean, I've been living in sin for many, many years, and I'm going to continue to do so. My partner and I have no plans at all to get married. We've been together 32 years, and it wouldn't make any difference to us. As Lara said, all the laws were equalised in terms of, let's say, inheritance and medical attorney and all of those kinds of things. So legally there is no need for it, and I didn't join the women's movement to fight for marriage. I joined the women's movement back in 1973 to fight against marriage. So it's a tricky thing. So I know a number of people who are now happily married who have been unmarried for all their lives. It also worries me that it's a process of domestication of the gay, lesbian, LGBTI community, that it creates what I would call an appropriation, pulling people into the centre. Now, I know there are a lot of people who just want acceptance, and that's quite reasonable. But I also saw Tony Abbott, who used to be our former Prime Minister, one of the worst that we've had. His sister is a lesbian. And when the vote went through, he said, well, I will go to her wedding. And, you know, there's something there that says all these people just voted because they know that gays and lesbians throw really good parties. You know? Is there anything more to it than that? That bothers me. So it had no effect on me. I know some people are really super duper happy. Some of my friends who I thought wouldn't do it have gotten married. And it is a shift in the social acceptance that's gone on. But beyond that, for me, it's meaningless, I guess. But I agree totally with Lara about it being a sham, total sham.
So I'm just going to ask Hari to play clip number 4. And the reason I'm doing this is all of you must remember that this was recorded yesterday and Lara had no idea what Susan was going to say here. So if you could play clip number 4, it also has my next question, which Lara reads out.
I just realised that for the last question I did no analysis of the institution of marriage. Susan will do it. So the next question that Nandini has put to me is my favourite. So she says, I love how you use language, cartographic relief, you say in the book, and the language and identity of these women is not known. It seems to me symbolic of the systematic erasure of women's writing down the ages, a recurring theme in both Looper and Lamb and Dark Matters by Susan too. Yes. Any thoughts on reclaiming words, on making new languages and structures? Yeah, I think that for me that's the theme and the heart of the book, in that both sisters are engaged in this activity of trying to create meaning in new ways and finding a new sort of, not a new, but trying to use existing visual languages, that is cartography and painting, to make visible an experience that is not otherwise visible. And they're both in each of their different endeavours. They're struggling with the sort of structures and processes of how you do that, of representation, of how you make meaning, or translate experience into meaning. And it's not by chance that I made the sisters these characters of these professions of a cartographer and a painter. It's because I really thought that would convey that theme and its relationship to these themes of exile and displacement and what it means to be marginalised or at the centre. The cartographer, in fact, even sort of, I think, takes it a step further. She believes that cartography is actually an improvement on reality because it makes visible sort of fine-grained detail that isn't visible to the naked eye, and that you can only pick up by measuring with her sort of complex tools, her sensitive tools. So she thinks that cartography actually illuminates reality in a way that just looking at reality can't. And she goes a step further as well, to not give it away, but sort of later in the novel she actually undertakes this action that works to shift the very frame of reference of cartography to put herself at the centre in an act that is about sort of recentering herself as a sort of marginalised individual. And I think, just because I love this question so much, Nandini, you also spoke, I think, about erasure and the erasure of women's identities and what they produce sort of creatively. And Susan will be able to talk about this much better than I. But in My Sister Chaos, this choice not to name the sisters and not to name the country, not to name the war, was deliberate as well, and it was designed to sort of create that sort of sense of invisibility, of almost a non-identity. So the sisters are the only ones to speak each other's names in the book. We know that other people speak them, but they mispronounce them or they confuse them. And of all the characters in the book, only the sisters sort of share a language. And yeah, that's an attempt by me to sort of try and convey this sense of them only being real and visible to each other and otherwise being sort of erased by their society and their relationship to the outside world as being one of sort of dislocation. Okay, great question.
This actually reminded me of something you had written in Cow, where you said these are stories about cows who have lost their histories. Some say there are no such histories, that they never existed. Others say they existed and but have been lost. And the idea of women searching out each other's histories and documenting them is seen again in Lupin and Lamb, where, while seeming playful, the poems also contain, I would say the text contains a very urgent sense of we have to document these before they are lost, and it's women writers across millennia uniting in this beautiful sort of I'm searching. I think new words have to be invented for such gatherings as you conjure up in Lupin and Lamb, where there are women writers gathering across millennia to document each other's work, and it will all be lost. So if you could speak about erasure of women's work in that context.
Well, I have a number of poems in Lupin and Lamb which are called the Lost Texts, and they range from a present-day language, which is a dog language, and it is not written. There's a photo of it on the back cover, actually, and this was an artwork created by a friend of mine who also did the covers of Lara's and my books, and it finishes with a poem about a 300,000-year-old image called La Lupa Paleolitica, which is the wolf, Paleolithic wolf woman, La Donna Lupa Paleolitica, sorry. And it's a genuine piece of work that is in a museum in Ancona in Italy. And her image is on a little rock about this big, and it's in the same room as all the stones. It's really weird. And so in between them are a number of other lost texts, and I made up languages and things, which was a lot of fun. But it also relates to dark matters, and I think because I know we're going to run out of time, I'm going to read a small excerpt from Dark Matters, which explains the title. Dark matter, in fact, is a concept that was discovered by a woman. Surprise, surprise. Vera Rubin is her name. You should learn it. It's very important. So this is a piece by Desi, who is the niece of Kate. Kate has left her a whole lot of papers, and Desi's trying to figure out what on earth this is about. And so she's writing a PhD, of course, and she's writing her own novel. Anyway, this is what Desi writes. Dark matter is almost imperceptible, invisible, and yet it takes up space. Like a lesbian in a room full of people, she too takes up space. But who sees her? Visible and yet not. Just like Mrs. Gardner, who's an earlier character. Scientists say that dark matter is all around us, that the energy of ordinary matter is 5 times less than that of dark matter. I know lesbians like that, who have energy 5 times greater than that of ordinary people. It's not that they're not there, but no one is paying attention. Social obliviousness. The other thing is the impact clefts that lesbians produce. They are capable of knocking the earth sideways, of creating perturbations in the matrix of life. Scientists try to measure the amount of dark matter in the universe. I want to measure the number of lesbians. Both are equally elusive. How do you spot a lesbian? Only a lesbian seems to have the right antenna for it. And if you do that, someone for sure will say your measure is biased. No one seems to notice the bias that goes the other way, or that heterosexuals are forever measuring heterosexuals and they haven't even noticed that they're doing it. Oh, the frustrations of being a marginal voice. I think I'll just walk out with my head in the oort clouds and try not to notice. I'm going to be like Eris, cause strife in the outers. And in a way, this is a continuation of a theme that I began in a book I published back in 2005, which you don't even know about yet. It's this one called The Butterfly Effect, and you probably know that from physics. It's, you know, the wings of a butterfly can cause storms on the other side of the world. Well, somebody, a lesbian saying that she's a lesbian can bring down governments. It can create storms in families. It can do all sorts of things. But it's also, for me, it's the best thing I've ever done. I have no regrets whatsoever of deciding to be a lesbian at the age of 23. No, actually, at the age of 9, I said I wasn't going to get married until I was 23. By 23, I knew which way I was going to go.
I know we are running out of time, but then there are just 2 more questions. And since this is the last session, I hope you'll bear with us a little bit, because I love what Lara has to say in response to these questions, and I'm really looking forward to what Susan will say. And quite like the women in Lupa and Lamb, we are going back and forth through time. So the next question that I asked Lara is something that I already know the answer to since I've seen her response. This is about when I read Susan's and Lara's biographies, I realized that both of them were people who work with their bodies. And so am I. I've been dancing all my life, but then the last few years I started taking it up seriously, practicing for hours a day. And for the last year or so, I've started learning this martial art called Kalaripayattu. And I was thinking about how that has changed the way I write. Because your body begins to transform, you become more flexible, there are more things you can do, you feel different, and then you realize your mind has also begun to transform. And you think differently, and just as you carry yourself differently physically, you also carry yourself differently emotionally and mentally. And so I put this question to Lara about, Lara is a dancer, professional dancer, and I had asked her about what Haruki Murakami speaks about as well, and what I talk about when I talk about running. The idea that a writer must be fit in order to be able to write. That your body must be fit for your mind to be fit. And we've skipped over a few answers, so Hari, if you could play number 7. I asked Lara about how dance and writing feed into each other.
I found this such food for thought, because they so do, but I can't work out how. Because I was thinking about dance it's almost the opposite in some ways. It's so physical in the sense of it's part of the real. It's the physical reality in space and in this sort of and in time as well. It's absolutely in the here and now. And I remember noting that that's just otherwise not a very big part of my life, the here and now. And it's not a very big part of writing as well, which is a flight of imagination where you can go to, you're in other locations, other times, constantly. But there is something about dancing, the feeling of dancing, and that incredible sort of physical and temporal realness of it that feels like writing, and especially like a first draft or early drafts, which is that period of sort of letting go and trying to get into a sort of flow or zone and being cut off from the world, like really absolutely 100% concentrating on what you're doing. So I can't say what it is that links them. I know that they feel the same. Later drafts of writing, no. Later drafts, when you get into editing, not so much. That's a completely different process and doesn't feel like dancing at all. It feels like plodding along a little bit, stepping one foot in front of the other. But yeah, those early drafts, definitely. There's something almost visceral about writing. There's something very sensual about it. Almost a little bit sexy sort of writing. That's as far as I got with your question. I'd be really interested to hear what Susan says and what your own experience is too, Nandini, because I think it's a fascinating one.
Susan is a circus aerialist. Yeah. So clearly everyone wants to hear what you have to say.
Well, as I said before, I grew up on a farm. I spent a lot of time in trees, in the shearing shed hanging out of the rafters, in the wheat bin hanging off the rafters in them as well. So I had a childhood that suggested I might go on to something like that, but of course I didn't. But I remember with the circuses coming around the country town that I lived near, and just thinking I would love to be able to do that, especially the aerialists. Well, at the age of 42, I took up aerials. And at first I wasn't particularly good. I could hang by my legs because I knew how to do that from childhood. But over the years, I got better and better, and I got stronger and stronger and stronger, and I started doing circus and aerials and various other things. Maybe 3, 4, 5 days a week. I became really over the top. And the best thing was when you did a show and you had a 3-week rehearsal period in the lead up to the show. By the time the show started, you could do things you've been trying to do all those months while you'd been learning. I learnt a lot of things. I learnt strength. I used to do tissue. Now, tissue is that long piece of material that you see people hanging off. And it is fantastic. It is so exciting. You can wrap yourself in it, you can make shapes, you can do all sorts of wonderful things, and then you can learn drops. And a drop is where you wrap yourself a particular way and then you let go, and then you fall, and you roll down, and you finish up in a nice catch, you know, the material catches you. My specialist move on the trapeze was what's called backhang to clicks. Backhang is when you're there and you've got the bar across here, you're like this, and then you just fall backwards and your ankles catch you. The first, I did it 3 times before the show, my very first show, and the 3 times I did it during rehearsal, I screamed. Somehow when I got to the show, I did it and I didn't scream because I knew I wasn't meant to. But it did play in some ways into dark matters, because sometimes when you're doing an aerial thing, especially at the beginning, you really don't know what you're doing, it hurts. Or you finish up in a bad position. You think, oh God, I hope I don't have to hold this. Or you're basing somebody and they're in the wrong spot and you're trying to hang on so they don't crash. And so when I was writing Dark Matters, there were a certain number of things that I did that made me think about pain, made me think about torture, made me think about how it's okay when you're doing something like that and you've chosen to do it, but we all know that in torture you can't say stop. You can never say no. You don't know how long it's going to go on. And so that was something that did feed into my thinking in Dark Matters, and the ability to withstand a certain amount of pain. But what you can't withstand is uncertainty. And that, I think, is the core of torture, as well as the humiliation and the way in which you're not given any option to get out. And for me, I think, while I celebrate being a lesbian, I think that we also need to recognise that around the world there are many lesbians who are being tortured. There are no campaigns, or very few campaigns for those women, because of course nobody is going to support an organisation who is out there saying things in favour of lesbians. We have to be the most underrepresented group in terms of those sorts of campaigns. The lesbians in South Africa who have been subjected to corrective rape. In all my years, and I've been working in this area now for 15 odd years, in all my years of doing this work, I've only ever seen one news report about that on TV. And there are reports now on the internet, but I think we have to make visible the things that are being done to lesbians.
Given how much we've laughed before this, you wouldn't expect it, but Dark Matters, as the title suggests, is a rather dark book. And so both Dark Matters and My Sister Chaos were very, very difficult books for me to read. They're beautiful books. But your mind will be, to put it mildly, fucked when you're done with them for a long time. So, so the last question, which I have, they were actually 2 questions, but Lara combined them, and I think that works really well. So part of it was that for a very long time, women have been portrayed as enemies of each other, and we have equivalent idioms in every language that I know. And there's a very mild term, you know, sibling rivalry or sister rivalry, and Freud had his own fantastic theories about it, of course, about mothers and daughters and whatnot. But in all literature that has been largely produced by men, women are often pitted against each other, shown to hate each other, undermine each other. So I'd asked Lara for her thoughts on that, as well as something which Lara pointed out was very closely related to it, that so much of women's writing about women harks back to the trope of the mad woman in the attic. So I'd asked her for her thoughts on that, and if you could play the last clip, Hari.
I think they're related. Is that so? I don't know if you will have talked for your audience's sake about the book Mad Woman in the Attic. Was it Gilbert and Gubar, I think, written in the late 70s, analysis of sort of Victorian literature. It's one of my favourite books. I think it was really well done. That sort of talked about this sort of literary trope based on, I think it was Jane Eyre, of a crazy woman that's husband of Mr. Rochester who's locked in the attic, and that being a metaphor for the sort of behaviour that women aren't allowed, or even or what it is when women write, like this sort of creative beast that they have. And you're absolutely right, Nandini, in picking up on that. In my book, My Sister Chaos, I had that in mind with this idea of the different levels in the house that the cartographer is mapping, and these two women living on different levels at one point, and the idea that one of them is the mad woman in the other's attic, or the mad woman in the other's basement. Because I think it's such a powerful sort of metaphor. And what it goes to is this idea of what is acceptable female behaviour. And we know that historically the sort of window, if you like, or range of what is acceptable female behaviour under patriarchy has been defined very narrowly, and has to be prized open further and further. Arguably, it's still pretty narrow, and it's in fact not even a range of behaviour that it's almost possible to fit within as a real human being that has experiences and emotions and feelings. So the suggestion, I think, in both Mad Woman in the Attic and in your question about women being portrayed as each other's enemies, is that women themselves sort of participate in this policing of other women's behaviours, and in sort of not negating, but sort of what's the word? Criticising behaviours that fall outside the spectrum of what's considered sort of respectable. But that really, because that window or that spectrum is so narrow, really what it is that we're policing or criticising is other versions of ourselves. So, and I think that's the idea that you're getting to in your question, Nandini. And so, yes, subverting that trope is I think really important, and showing a fuller range of female behaviour and experience is really important. And in My Sister Cass, I do deliberately use this idea of the sisters as being possibly these two sides of the same coin, or it's even left open that they might be the same person. They may be different, they may be the same, but that idea of they're different versions of a similar self. Yes, what else do I want to say about that? I'm just quickly checking my notes. Oh yeah, and I like the idea in the Mad Woman of the Attic of the idea that the suppression of those sort of more dangerous forms of the self leads to that woman in the attic or in the basement or whatever wreaking havoc on your life. And the other idea I actually think was a useful one to draw from the Mad Woman in the Attic is this idea of there being two texts, a palimpsest, I always say that wrong, palimpsest I think it is, where you have one below the other, and that if you can read Jane Eyre and these this Victorian literature as two different sorts of text, one of which is very acceptable and one of which is subversive all the way. And I like that idea and played with that a bit in My Sister Chaos as well, with the idea of the text of the map and the text of the painting that at different points in the book are hidden under each other. Yes, that's it. And that's it for my questions as well. So thanks again, everyone, and bye.
Her answer gave me chills. Just the idea that when she said it's left open that they could be the same person, I could feel the goose flesh on my neck. And then I was like, oh my God, this was a whole dimension that I didn't think of. So, Susan, if you would like to respond to that question.
It's interesting, and I must say I had trouble relating to the idea of the mad woman in the attic initially. But actually with Lara's answer, I've got a few ideas. Maybe it's because I grew up on a farm in a place with wide open spaces, and attics were not something that we knew anything about. However, I do notice that in my book Dark Matters, I have one of the characters who's carted off and imprisoned in a very small cell. So perhaps I'm more into this idea than I initially thought. But certainly, in terms of the mad woman, I think lesbians are very frequently just considered to be mad, and sadly, quite a number of lesbians have been certified mad, and that's really bad. And then they really are locked up and have been locked up. I have a very close friend who suffers from schizophrenia, and that happened to her. And she actually has come through that rather well, and she's very funny. And when she goes to a book launch, she says, I can sell my book at somebody else's book launch because I'm a professional lunatic. She even sold a book to somebody at a funeral once. So, it does give you a few excuses if you can do it well, and my friend Sandy can do that. I've never had the chutzpah to go there. But I think that out there kind of actions, living life differently, and Kate is actually arrested because she's been a lesbian. In there, which I think you'd probably get, some of you. And that in a way is also an interesting thing to be able to do. Who are you writing for? Well, I'm writing, I guess, mostly for lesbians, but I'm also writing because I want people who are not lesbians to think about these issues and to think about the real women who have been subjected to violence of various kinds.
Because I know you've been reading my book since Day After Tomorrow. Our roles are going to be reversed, but there is a person called Joseph Lobdell who. So I didn't know whether to say her or him, because Lobdell is referred to as her in all the reports which came out in the mid 1800s when Lobdell lived. And Lobdell was put in an asylum, spent decades in an asylum, in a lunatic asylum, and died there. And one of the cases against Lobdell was, so Lobdell as Joseph married a woman and was found out to be a woman herself, is what the report says. And so the trial that Lobdell underwent was for disturbing the peace of the state, which brings me back to what you said about the terrorists of patriarchy. On that note, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you very much, Lara, who can't hear us but will hear us online. And if there are any questions, and I'm sure there are plenty, so anyone who has questions, and yes, please.
Hi, it was great listening to all three of you. Thank you so much for the session. I have two questions mainly. First one would be kind of unstructured. The second one is more to the point. So my first one is about the way the panel discussion was named, women and lesbians. So a lot of my queer friends had an issue with it when we were discussing we're going, because it's like saying men and gay people, right? Because are they two mutually exclusive subsets of each other? Because usually we say, when we talk about masculinity, we say a person is less of a man if they're gay. And that's something that as lesbians or bisexuals or pansexuals also have an issue with, that are we less of people because we're not heteronormative? So that's one more, just a clarification regarding that when it was named, where did whoever named it came from? The second one is about your views on marriage. So I know the surface of the patriarchal interpretation of the idea of marriage and how marriage fits there. I also know some of the capitalist views of how family, the idea of a unit of family, caters to capitalism as a whole. But where do you come from? What are your views on it?
To answer the first question, I did send a few words off to the organisers, one of which was Exiled and one of which was lesbian. But beyond that, I don't know quite how it then got into a sentence. So
not me either.
So I thought it was a strange title too, but that's okay. I mean, I just really wanted to talk about lesbians. So on the second question, well, as I said, I didn't join the women's movement to fight for marriage, and so, I mean, that was one of the things that in my initial thinking all those decades ago, it was something I'd never even contemplated. And marriage for me, I mean, I know there can be good marriages, I know there can be terrible marriages, and I think part of the problem for me is the involvement of the state in marriage. And that's one reason why I would not wish to get married, because I don't actually feel that the state has any role at all to play in that part of my life. I have a committed relationship. For me, that's sufficient. But it's also that, you know, if for some peculiar reason my partner and I decided to separate, we wouldn't have the cost of divorce. You know, that's a plus too, I think. And the divorce industry will be terrific for some people in future years.
Any other questions?
Hi, I thought it was a fantastic session, and I want to know if, when you consider queer literature, is there as much, are there as many books or as much literature describing the lesbian experience as there are describing the gay experience?
I can't really answer that question because I've read a lot of lesbian literature, and I have not read a lot of gay literature, just as I have not read a lot of literature by men in the last couple of decades, because I thought I had to kind of catch up. And very occasionally I do read books by men, so it's not that I don't know and so forth, but I decided I needed to do a bit of affirmative action on my own reading. So yes, there's heaps of great lesbian writing out there. There's also heaps of great writing by women who are not lesbians, and I read a lot of that as well. In India, if you can get your hands on work by Suniti Namjoshi, who's an Indian writer who's lived in England for a very long time, i.e. she is in exile, and her partner is an Australian, also living in exile in England. So, you know, the first book of Suniti's that I read is called Feminist Fables and was published in 1982. She's got these wonderful, tiny little Indian-style fables that really knock the socks off you, as we say in Australia. Some of her books are available through Zuban, and for the others you'll have to contact us at Spinifex Press, which is the publishing house that I co-founded back in 1991. So we have quite a lot of her works that we've published, and her latest is called, well, our version is called Aesop the Fox, and Zuban's is called Foxy Aesop, I think. So we have slightly different titles and we have different covers and things like that, but it's the same book on the inside.
I think we have time for one last question before Prasanna chases us out of here.
Hello. Hi. So when you mentioned, when you were reading a quote from Dark Matters, you were talking about how Elena had to either choose to uproot herself from her village and her life, or just take what she got inside of the small confines of her rural existence. And like that's historically the experience of a lot of queer people, right? Like you've got to either completely uproot yourself or just choose to accept what you have. And often they would find new roots around small clusters of other queer people. But now with the expansion of the quote-unquote community and the way technology has played an effect, and also with the kind of policing of queer spaces that make them largely over 18 and over 21, that doesn't allow queer youth access to majority queer spaces, it's become harder and harder for there to be any place for there to be a community to take root. So we're again starting to see a kind of like displacement, and technology has largely aided the displacement rather than remedying it. So and now I feel like there's a trend towards trying to look more historically and more intersectionally, seeing that queer people are coming from a lot of different cultures and you can't really call them a community, rather more a cluster of communities. So I'm just trying to figure out like how does your writing like place itself within that kind of effort? Does it, and do you see there like being a way to go forward looking for like queer histories and like, you know, cultures? Sorry.
I think that in the 1970s we didn't have internet. In fact, we didn't have internet really until, what is it, about the mid-1990s for me, a little bit later here in India, then boom, India really took off. I think I think you're right about it cutting off some things. It makes communication easier, but it also makes observance of that communication by people you might not necessarily want to have watching to do so. So I think just on that front, I think we're going to have to learn to be subversive all over again. And in the 1970s, I mean, I was reading books from writers that I'd never heard of, and we were having conversations with one another about lesbian writing, mostly either from Australia or from the US or the UK at that time. But then Suniti's work came to me in the early 1980s, and you know, that kind of opened the door to me to find other work in different places. So I feel that, I mean, I'm writing out of that historical position, and I kind of hope that that knowledge is at least continued through my writing. My first novel, which I published 20-something years ago, it took me that long to get back to writing another one, dealt with issues of growing up as a lesbian, but also growing up with epilepsy, and so this kind of double bind thing. Should I call myself disabled, or should I call myself a lesbian, or do I somehow have to do both, or what am I? You know, so or am I a rural Australian? Or, you know, like that whole thing of the multiple identity thing. And I think in a way that that's become a bit of a trap, because it cuts us off from one another in interesting ways. So I think all I can do really in terms of my writing, and likewise also with my publishing work, is to put the work out there, to try and get as wide a range of voices as possible, and different ways of seeing the world, trying to skew people's view of reality in different ways, so that somebody reading my work or reading the work of others that we publish is forced to sit up and take notice of a different view of the world. I guess does that answer your question? Sort of? Okay, thanks. It's a really hard question.
Thank you ever so much, Susan, and thanks all of you for staying back and making the session so enriching.
And thank you so much for coming along, to a session with the word lesbian in it. I thought, maybe I'll only have 3 people. But that's all right, 3 quality people is really... But look, we had a whole room full. So, and thank you to the organisers, and thank you to, the hospitality that I'm having here. So it's really great. And feel free to come and ask me questions, talk to me, ignore me, whatever it is you need to do.
The best way to get your questions answered is to buy a book and line up for a signature. All authors love that.
Sure. And I've got I've got mostly 3 books available here, but some others as well. So, yeah, of my books. And don't forget Lara, in Tamil and English.
Thank you very much, Nandini and Susan, of course, Lara, for that amazing session. With this, today's sessions at the Slate come to an end. See you all tomorrow. Thank you.